Hello, welcome to another edition of Truth and Rhythm, brought to you by funkandstuff.net. This is the interview show that gets deep into the pocket with contemporary music's foremost masters of the groove. Available in video format at funkandstuff.net and on YouTube, Truth and Rhythm can also be enjoyed on the go as audio podcast edition from iTunes and other leading providers. I'm your host, Scott Dr. GX Goldfine, musicologist and author of Everything is of the One, the First Guide to Funk. If you don't have your copy, get on over to Amazon and grab one. Great way to start off the new year. My guest today is musician, producer, and engineer Jim Callon, who's also a founder of JDC Records, formerly a record distributor and presently a Southern California-based record store. For the purposes of this program, though, Callon's big claim to fame is having served as one of P-Funk's chief recording engineers for many of their best-known albums of the 1970s. That list includes timeless funk classics like Funkadelic's albums, Let's Take It to the Stage, Hardcore Jollies, Parliament's Chocolate City, my all-time fave, Mothership Connection, which there's a gold record behind me for that, the close of Dr. Funkenstein, live P-Funk Earth Tour, and then also Bootsy's Rubber Band, Stretching Out, and All the Name is Bootsy Baby, Eddie Hazel's Games, Dames, and Guitar Things, perhaps the best title ever, and Fred Wesley and the Horny Horns, A Blow for Me and A Toot for You. Just ahead, we'll find out how Callon got into music, his path to hooking up with the U.S. funk mob, what it was like being at the center of the peak of the P-Funk experience, as well as other projects of his and what he's up to nowadays. So with all that, I'm delighted to officially welcome Jim Callon to the Truth and Rhythm Studios. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Nice day outside here in California. You're back east, right?
I am. We've had the bomb vortex or whatever they're calling it.
Yeah, well, my prayers go with you.
Fortunately, we've been spared snow where I am, but it's been sub-zero wind chill. So
yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and you're coming to us from San Pedro, right?
Port of Los Angeles. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we started our distribution business here in the 80s, and we still have it going, by the way, but although it's minimal compared to what it was then. And we still have the record label going and the record store, of course. Yeah.
Well, I certainly know that area well. I grew up out there, and I have the Lakers hat still, you know.
I see, yeah.
And lived in Culver City, Santa Monica, that area. So, yeah, I miss it, especially when the weather's like this.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
And I also wanted to share with you, Jim, that I'm quite familiar with your label because throughout the 80s, I was a disc jockey, a mobile disc jockey out there. And so I was a member of, maybe you've heard of Impact and Resource Record Pools.
Sure, we used to service those pools.
Yeah, I was a longtime member and used to get those 12 inches with the JDC on them, and I spun many of those.
Well, thank you very much.
Good stuff. All right. Well, we're going to dig into your backstory and then get into some P-Funk. So how did you first get into music? I know that you also play some instruments, and what's your background and influences, and where are you from, Jim?
When I attended UCLA, I started a band with some guys I knew, and we were playing fraternity parties and school dances and so forth, and kept going with that. And eventually the band signed to Warner Brothers, and we did an album, the Glass Family Electric Band, in the 60s, which was reissued on vinyl last year with a bonus album. And so I did that for a while. We went on the road. We played with a lot of the groups of the time, the Grateful Dead, the Doors, Janis Joplin. Everybody was just coming up then, so it wasn't like these big superstars like they have become now. And then I got tired of doing that. Around the 70s, I got interested in studio work after watching our producer and engineer on our album. So next step for me was I did some production, and I became a recording engineer because that's where I really wanted. I was very interested in sound. And I worked at the studio. The guy wanted to make it a country and western studio, so we were working with people like Glenn Campbell and Mac Davis and people like that, and it was cool. But one night, my one of the other engineers I worked with, who had done a couple sessions with Funkadelic, he said to me, "Hey, man, tonight these guys are coming in from Detroit, and they're really kind of crazy guys, and would you just kind of do me a favor? Would you work it tonight?" And I said, "Sure." Well, for me, it was love at first sight when the guys came in, because I was working with what I considered to be real music again.
What about what year was that?
That had to be maybe 74. They came into the studio and we cut that night. We cut Red Hot Mama and Standing on the Verge of Getting It On. And it was jumping. I mean, it was rocking and jumping. And I said, hallelujah, this is a good match. And also it was, since I had been kind of a hippie in the 60s, and these guys were kind of hippies in the 70s. So we had a lot in common in that area. Anyway, that led to many recordings, which were always mixed at that studio. I always mixed them at Hollywood Sound because that had the sound. And actually, you know, we were smoking a lot of pot. We were dropping a lot of acid. No hard drugs, just pot and acid, just like in the 60s with us hippies. And, you know, they used to give us a lot of shit because, hey, you're never going to get a hit. You guys are too stoned in there. Well, we had the first million seller come out of that studio. And much to the chagrin of the owner of the studio, who wanted it to be a mecca for country music, all of a sudden it became a mecca for black music. So we had Earth, Wind, and Fire recording there, and, you know, Crusaders, Boss Skaggs came in to record Lowdown there. And the studio got known as, you know, the place to go for that kind of R&B funk sound. But anyway, that's how I got into that. And
Wow.
after George told me funk is greater than God, I left and started my own label a few years later.
Wow. So did you get formal training for the engineering, or did you kind of pick it up from others? Did you have a mentor? How did that?
I had, you know, I had other guys teaching me, and I was observing, and, you know, I just fell into it. I wasn't a real technical guy, but I was a real good sound guy. I could pull sound out of the board, you know. And I got to tell you, your favorite album, Mothership Connection, I think that was my greatest accomplishment sound-wise with the P-Funk guys. Everything fell into place in that, and everything I tried worked. And the way we put it together, it was magical. Magical. Just knew that was going to be a big record, which it was.
Well, I got to tell you, the sonic differences in, you know, going from the earlier Westbound Funkadelic records to the Warner Brothers Funkadelic and Parliament, after Chocolate City, especially starting with Mothership, the richness and the clarity of the sound was just so remarkably fuller and richer.
Yeah.
What do you attribute that to?
Magic, you know, it just came together. You know, I worked with a lot of people, and we just, for some reason, this combination of things worked really well. And I must say that Bernie Worrell and I became very good friends from the very beginning. And he was classically trained, and he was a great composer. He could do anything on the keyboard, and his tastes were not limited to any one kind of music. And working with him was a magic combination too, sound-wise. So I attribute a lot of that to Bernie in particular, the other guys too, but Bernie in particular, and we had a thing going on between us, which was really helpful to that sound as well. I mean, you know, the guys recorded "Tear the Roof Off the Sucker" in Detroit with Jim Vitti. Then they brought the tapes out to me. It was like a 15-minute jam with a zillion different instruments. And the first thing I did was strip it clean and just start with the kick drum and build it up till we had only about 5 instruments, and cut the thing in half, and then start working from there. And somehow that opened up the air or the space that we needed to get that sound, which is really prevalent, especially on that album. But I credit Bernie a lot, and it's interesting when we did Eddie Hazel's Games, Dames, and Guitar Things, we switched places. Bernie became the engineer, and I became the piano player on California Dreamin'.
Oh, really?
So we had that kind of thing going on too. And we used to jam up at my house in Topanga Canyon, and loved Bernie. He passed away last year, and we released his final album on our record label, a joint venture with his wife, Judy. I credit a lot to him. And Eddie and I, too. Eddie, you know, when Eddie was in Lompoc, I took him a guitar up there so he could play in the 2 years he was incarcerated. That's where he learned California Dreamin'. He didn't even know the song, and one of the other guys there taught it to him. So he played it for me one day. We're sitting on the lawn outside, and I said, Eddie, we got to record this when you get out. And that's what we did. So it was all good. Those were great times. Those 3 or 4 years I was with all the guys. Fred Wesley, another one, another great guy to work with. And George, who called himself the referee, was always, one thing I'll say about George is he always let everybody do their best. Didn't try to hold you back from doing your best. And so that made for good recordings too.
What role did George take, or what was he like in the studio when the music was being created, and also after the fact, you know, around the engineering or post-production process?
You know, George, he's a Leo, and he's very, but he also is laid back and lets you, like I said, he lets you do your thing. Or some guys, some producers come in there and they want to get in, you know, this will sound better. Let me try this. George was pretty much never told you what to do, and neither with the musicians or myself or anybody. He just kind of let it happen. And that was a beautiful way of letting things develop. He called himself the referee. That's what he did. And you can see, not that he was a referee so much, but that he was an enabler of this thing to go on, this mood in the studio where you could do your best without anybody trying to block you. So I think that was his genius. And also, you know, I'd have to, sometimes with George, too many people would come in there and it would get too chaotic, and I'd have to say, George, we got to let some of these people out of here. And when I would record George singing, George was a really good singer. An example is All Your Goodies Are Gone. You know, I had everybody leave the studio. I turned the lights down. I put George out in the recording area and with one microphone, and man, he sang his ass off on that. We were able to work together really well. So there's some other things I can say about George, but I'm not going to.
So Gary Vitti was in
Jim Vitti.
Jim Vitti, sorry, he was in Detroit, and you were out in
United
California.
Sound. Yeah.
So did you guys communicate a lot, or what was that relationship like?
No, not too much. I mean, I'd I'd go out there, you know, and be around and for some of the recordings there, and but for the overdubs and the mixing, it was all done in Hollywood Sound. I mean, we worked at various studios, worked at the Ladyland in New York, and you know, when the group was on the road, we'd do recording in different areas. But generally speaking, they would cut tracks in Detroit and then bring them out to LA. Not always, though. Like I told you, Red Hot Mama and Standing on the Verge, we did that in Studio B at Hollywood Sound the first night I met them, which was, I mean, pulling off those two recordings the first night was nothing short of miraculous.
It is incredible. What a way to start.
Yeah, man. George used to tell me, you know, I say, you know, you guys are like, you remind me so much of the way we were in the 60s. And he said, well, you know, everything happens 10 years later in the ghetto. So that's why, and in the beginning it was the same. I mean, they were only doing psychedelics and pot. No hard drugs, no liquor, no nothing, you know. Then that degenerated over time, just like it did with the hippies. But for me, I got to, you know, continue my hippiness into the 70s because of that. So, yeah.
Jim, for those that maybe haven't been in a recording studio and aren't that familiar with it, could you just kind of talk a little bit about, you know, what sort of makes someone that does that more skilled than someone else, and what are some of the nuances or special qualities that an engineer can bring to the party, so to speak?
Oh, I think it's like anything else, you know, you just do it enough, you get good at it. And there are little things you learn a lot by mistake. You'll do something and it'll be a mistake, but it'll sound really good.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it just takes time, like everything else. You know, if you're going to do it good, it's going to take time. And I can't attribute it to any one thing. It's, you know, and like I say, sometimes there's magic and sometimes there's not. And we just had a lot of magic with P-Funk.
Do you think it helped that you did have an actual musical background too?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Especially, you know, I could communicate with Bernie in that way, and maybe a way that George couldn't. And George not being a musician himself, but a singer. Yeah, definitely, definitely very helpful. You know, and it's also like you can arrange the structure of a song. You know, it might be just a free jam, you know, which is cool, but well, let's make it into a song. I always would think of the song, you know. Yeah. So yeah, very helpful.
To what extent do you think that, you know, the classics or hits are made in their initial form versus how they end up being edited later on, or post-production added to it? Like you mentioned how you brought the clarity of sound to tear the roof off. You know, can you kind of make silk out of a sow's ear in that process?
No. You have to have something there to begin with. And fortunately, you had guys that were good players and could improvise and just create things out of nothing. I mean, sometimes those jams would turn out to be 3 different records because you'd have so many instruments going on. Well, let's just use this, and this for this record, and let's use that, and that for the other record. When you got good players and they're loose, they're not uptight, makes all the difference in the world. But no, you cannot make something out of nothing. I guess they can do that today with all the digital stuff, but couldn't do it then.
So we talked a little bit about Eddie, about Bernie. Who were some of the other guys that you remember that were particularly, adept in the studio environment, or in the, engineering post-production part of it?
Bernie was the main guy by far. Okay. Eddie was just dependable as hell when you're going to record him. I mean, he was going to rip regardless. And by the way, his singing too. I recorded a song called Love Is Something, which I wrote and played guitar on and it got the Brides of Funkenstein their deal on Atlantic. And I'm always pissed at George for not letting it be on the album when it came out. And so is Don Silva pissed at him for that. And we don't even have the tapes anymore. And it was such a great recording. Anyway, with Eddie showed up at the session. I cut the basic track with my own band, and then Eddie showed up at the session for the vocals, and he didn't play guitar on it, but he sang. And initially I said, "Hey Eddie, I don't need you on this, man. I really don't." "Oh, please, man, I feel it." And I said, "Okay, all right." So he sang incredibly on this. I mean, it moved everybody. You could not sit down in the studio. You couldn't do anything but just look there in awe. And, so things like that, I mean, that was incredible, his contribution, and not just as a guitar player. But getting back to the other guys, okay, the guys that I thought really did well, I mean, Gary Scheider was easygoing and nice, but he contributed a lot. When Glenn Goins came around, he sang like an angel. Of course, Bootsy, when he came on board, you had Bootsy, and he contributed a lot, and probably as a producer had more input than anybody else at a certain point, other than Bernie. But who else? So many guys, But Fuzzy and all those singers, Ray, in the beginning, I loved their harmony. I loved what they did. I'm sorry that I can't remember all their names. Grady,
Calvin,
just such great guys, Ray, yeah. Ray was the sweetest guy. And I meet now tons of people that say they were in Funkadelic or P-Funk, and I don't know who they are, but I think what happened after this, with the golden age, if you will, there many guys came and went in the band, and so I don't know much about that, what happened post me.
So were you at times ever, spending the night in the studio, or?
Of course.
Yeah. So, that must have been a crazy experience and environment.
Oh yeah. Well, we were smoking a lot of pot, like I said, and we did take acid occasionally. And it's very interesting because there was a time when Earth, Wind, and Fire were in one studio there, and we were in the other. And you'd look in the window to the studio, and it'd be this just haze of smoke in our room. And those guys were like, they would take a break and go out for ice cream. And they're sweet guys, nice guys. I love them to death, and made such good music. But so they got to calling us, we were the Rolling Stones of black music, and Earth, Wind, and Fire were the Beatles, the nice, clean-cut guys, and we were the whatever. But I had the great satisfaction with Ramona, who was the woman at the front desk. Every time I'd come out of the studio, she'd say, "You guys will never get a hit in there. And you're smoking all that pot. And you can't do anything right, possibly." And when we hit with Mothership Connection, you know, it was 3 million copies worldwide, and it was such a massive hit. Nobody had ever come close coming out of that studio with anything like that. I just love to see Ramona in the morning and just give her a little smile, walk back into the studio.
How did the vibe overall change with all the musicians in P-Funk once they hit it big like that?
Well, in comes cocaine, which is okay for a minute, and then comes crack, which was not okay. And, you know, with a few exceptions in the post-Golden era, like Atomic Dog and One Nation Under a Groove, I thought things started to go downhill, even as early as Dr. Funkenstein. And I think this happens so many times with groups and music, and, you know, in the beginning it's good and it's fresh and then for some reason you can't recapture it, and people start being angry at one another, and the whole vibe that you had to begin with, which made the music so magical, is gone. So, I don't know, man.
Well, that's definitely the case. It was a shame, but I mean, the run of Mothership Connection, Clones of Dr. Funkenstein, Funkadelic, and Motor Booty Affair, phenomenal run of those 4 albums. I mean, they all have strong concepts, strong music.
Right. Yeah.
Then the
right.
drop off was pretty precipitous after that.
Yeah, you're right. That's probably the end of it. Yeah. And Eddie had passed away. Well, he hadn't passed away, but he was not active anymore. Yeah. Anyway, no, a lot of good music came from that era.
So, but you were also involved in all those other albums I mentioned as well, right?
I was not involved in Motor Booty Affair, and I was not involved in Funkadelic.
But you were still doing, Eddie's album came out in '78. So that was that same time frame. Was that held for a while, or why were you still working on one thing and not another?
Are you sure it was '78? I'm not sure. You know,
maybe '77. 77. Yeah. So
that was the last albums I recall doing were The Name Is Bootsy and Stretching Out and Bootsy's Rubber Band and Fred Wesley and the Horny Horns and a couple albums there, and Parlette and Rides of Funkenstein. And so we were doing all these offshoot albums after Mothership Connection. You know, it was like, okay, everybody gets to do an album now, all the members of the band. I don't know, you know, literally, George told me one day in the studio that he thought funk was bigger than God. And I don't know where he was coming from with that, but that sticks in my head as the time I remember where I decided to get off the ship. But yes, he made great records without me. He made One Nation Under a Groove without me.
not just Knee Deep.
Yeah, Not Just Knee Deep, right. Atomic Dog. But, you know, he still had Bernie, and Bernie was contributing. He was laying the foundation for those records. I can't stress to you how much Bernie was so important to that whole era. Yeah.
You know, the thing about P-Funk is, and you talked about this a little bit, Jim, but, you know, the vocals were so elaborate and complex, and
Yeah.
you know, the rhythm and also the horn arrangements. What, you know, how did you kind of make sure that they would not be drowned out, that they would fit where they need to fit. And did you have to approach each of those kind of differently? You know, the rhythm, the vocals, the guitar, so forth.
Yeah, I mean, as I told you before, the main thing was making space for the sound to come out. I mean, if you have too much stuff in there, no matter how good it is, it's going to cancel everything out. You know, your ears need to hear clearly the vocals, the horns, the guitar. The rhythm is most important. You know, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. So you had to
Spike or something.
No, this guy's doing an interview with me.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. You know, you had to. I think space is the most important thing, and like I told you, I developed this thing because there was so much going on there. Where I would start with the kick drum, just the kick drum. Then I would add the rest of the drums little by little. Then I would add the bass, and then I would decide what else belongs in there and what doesn't. And I mean, the crowning achievement for this for me was Swing Down, Sweet Chariot, Stop and Let Me Ride, where in one part I took out everything but Bernie and the drums, and we achieved this kind of real spacey, just beautiful sound by doing that. So I think less is more in terms of, you know, placing the instruments. But Fred Wesley and his horns, by the way, I didn't have to do much. He knew what to play. He knew where to play it, you know. He knew not to get in the way of a vocal or of something else that was going on. So I was working with great guys. I mean, no doubt about it.
It's interesting to hear you say that, you know, the Hazel track and the Verge track, with all the stuff that was coming out and all those different, you know, offshoots and everything. It sounds like there's still some good material that maybe never got out there.
Oh yeah. Love Is Something, but not the George put it out later, and I think, man, you know, George wanted to be in control all the time, and I think he sabotaged it because it was so good. It was such a funky track, and it was so soulful. And when he put it out on some Japanese compilation, probably to fill space, he took off all the funk, and he added this syrupy saxophone, which turned it into an awful, awful record. Unfortunately, the 24-track tape is somewhere, and I have a very poor cassette mix of the original mix we did that got the brides their deal on Atlantic. But it's lost in the ethos somewhere until somebody comes up with it or finds it. You know, but whoa, what a track. It's legendary among P-Funk fans. But, you know, in George's version, you can't even hear Eddie, for one thing. It's like the King of Funk takes out all the funk, and he does it to preserve his place in the stratosphere.
Wow.
Okay?
Well, I'll tell you, there's been a lot of tracks, especially in the some of the 80s, but really in the 90s and afterwards, that had the foundation of being something strong, but however they mixed it or whatever, you know, kind of undermined it.
Yeah,
So,
I have some things that Bernie gave me that are pretty amazing that we've never done anything with. That he recorded with the other guys, and yeah, there's stuff out there. There's probably a lot of stuff out there.
Bernie, you know, a lot of these shows that I'm doing, I mean, I was always a big fan, but to me, his legend is just growing ever bigger all the time because I interviewed Bill Laswell not too long ago, And according to him, he recorded probably like 100 albums with him alone.
Yeah.
Just unbelievable.
They did a lot of work together. Yeah.